Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Well Acquainted podcast. Today, we will be talking about the state of the student loan debt. We have a special guest with us on today, and he is a subject matter expert on this information, so you're in for a real treat. Before we introduce our guest, I just want to introduce myself as your co-host, Tamara. I'm a recent law graduate and a candidate for the July bar. And I'll now turn it over to my co-host, Nneka, and let her introduce herself to you all.
All right. Hello, WAP listeners and new listeners. Welcome to the Well Acquainted podcast. My name is Nneka. I am your other co-host. For those who are new to our platform, I am an attorney practicing in Washington, D.C., and I primarily practice labor law. Before we get started and dive into such an important topic, I want to briefly just congratulate our co-host, Tamara, from graduating law school this weekend from my alma mater, now hers, the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law. Law school is no easy feat, but you persevered. So congratulations on such an amazing accomplishment. I'm proud of you. With that being said, let's turn it over now to my dear friend, who's been a friend of mine for a few years now, Alpha Taylor. And I just want to give a brief introduction. Alpha Taylor is an attorney also based in Washington, D.C. He is a consumer law attorney for the National Consumer Law Center, where his focus is on the student debt crisis. In addition to that, Alpha previously worked as a staff attorney in Cincinnati, Ohio for the Legal Aid Society of Greater Cincinnati. And during that time, he handled foreclosure, eviction, and student loan cases. Alpha also did some notable work for Legal Aid Society, where he helped establish the Hamilton County Eviction Prevention Project. And he is a graduate of the Case Western University Law School. Let's welcome Alpha. And thank you for being here, Alpha.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Also, congrats to Tamara. Welcome to the family and welcome to the profession. It's a great profession, and wishing you all the best, as you hit up the bar in July.
Thank you so much,
Great.
Alpha.
Let's get started on this topic, right? So we're talking about the student debt, student loan crisis. And for those who aren't aware, President Biden, among promising that he was going to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court, which he recently just did, he also promised that he was going to cancel or forgive student loan debt. So one of the big questions that I have, that many attorneys have, that I've discussed this topic with, is whether he can legally do so. Can you provide your input on just that?
Great. And I think, Nneka, you hit it on the spot. When President Biden was running for office, he promised to forgive at least $10,000 in student debt. That is a promise that he made to voters. That is a promise that he made to Black voters, especially Black women voters who actually helped President Biden win the presidency. In regards to whether or not the president has the authority to cancel student debt, our position is that he, in fact, has the authority to do that. This is not a situation where we need some sort of an act of Congress for the president to use executive power to cancel student debt. The legal analysis that we have seen from Harvard Law School Center on Predatory Lending lays out the case under which the president has the authority under the ACA to settle a compromised debt owed to the United States through the Secretary of Education. And also, keep in mind that President Biden has not stated that he does not have the authority, right? So I think we are beyond the point as to whether or not he has the authority to, how is he going to implement student debt cancellation. Last year, his chief of staff, Ron Klain, stated that President Biden had ordered Secretary Cardona to draft a memo basically outlining his power as to whether or not he has the authority to do that. Now, we have not seen the context of that memo, but based on recent statement, like recently, if you're watching the news, we're hearing a lot of stuff from Jen Psaki and also people who are very close to the White House that, he is going to take some action. I believe the president himself said that he's going to take action, not in cancel the $50,000, but at least doing $10,000 student debt. So I think now the debate is, how is cancellation going to look like? How is he going to implement it?
And I'll briefly note, Alpha, I agree. Just from my own research, I think he has the legal authority to do so, and the White House officials have not definitively said he can't. In your question, you mentioned HEA, which is the Higher Education Act. For our listeners who may not know what that is, Alpha, can you briefly explain what the Higher Education Act is, and how it's relevant to the student loan crisis?
I mean, the Higher Education Act is essentially the statutory law governing, federal student loan programs. It also governs the authority of the Secretary of Education under the direction of the president. So it's a very specific law relating to the different type of loan that you have, whether you have direct loan or you have a FAIL loan, that's Family Education Loan Program. All of those loans are regulated under the HCA. So it's a federal statute, essentially, that governs, the Department of Education interaction for a federal student loan, and it also outlines the authority of the Secretary of Education.
So I have another question. For those who may know, WAP, our intent is to empower our communities one episode at a time, each and every perspective at a time. And this student debt crisis is undoubtedly going to be affecting a lot of communities, racially, based on your social economic status. And so one of my questions is, if President Biden is in fact going to forgive student loan debt, whether that be entirely or whether that be, we've seen in the headlines, up to 10K, maybe more, who is it particularly going to have the most impact on? What communities is this really going to be impacting?
I mean, that's a great question, Nneka. To answer that question, we have to look at who is being disproportionately impacted by the student debt crisis, right? And the data shows that African Americans, in comparison to all other races, are being more disproportionately impacted. African Americans tend to carry a higher amount of student debt coming out of college. Black women, they carry a substantial amount of student debt than any other group. As a matter of fact, Black women tend to owe $20,000 more in student debt than white women. So canceling student debt will really do a lot to advance, equity in regards to ensuring that students of color who've been disproportionately and unfairly burdened by student debt at least have a path towards student debt cancellation. Now, the question is how much is going to move the needle, right? If the president do $10,000, yes, certainly you will have some people, like many low-income borrowers. Now, I also want to stress that, I mean, these student loan borrowers are not just the doctors and the lawyers that we hear about who are making so much money and they don't want to pay their student loan debt. The data show, contrary to that, most student loan borrowers are low-income people who are defrauded by for-profit colleges. I'm talking about, that single mother who's, trying to, make her daily living, but she realized that, hey, I need to get this certification so that I can get that promotion. I need to get this certification so that I can earn more to provide for my family. She also have groups, disabled individuals who luckily President Biden has implemented reform to provide discharges for individuals who are, totally and permanently disabled, including older Americans. Older Americans also have student loan debt. Either they take out student loans for themselves or they got Parent Plus loan to support their children or grandchildren through college, and they are stuck with that student debt. And what happens is that debt follows them, and the government has extraordinary collection powers. You're talking about garnishing wages, taking, Social Security benefits payments, but also, offsetting tax refund from people who need it the most. So these are the people who are carrying the heaviest burden. You have 9 million borrowers who are in default of federal student loan. They're already defaulted. They're in the circle of default. They have no way out of default. And some of these borrowers, they don't owe much. They don't owe the $200,000, the $500,000. Their debt is maybe $10,000 to $50,000, but they can't get out of it unless there is some sort of action, in regards to the administration relieving these borrowers from the burden of student debt.
Yeah, Alpha, I have a question. So what do you say to the one percenters like Elon Musk that I think he recently tweeted about the student loan debt crisis, and he was saying how people should pay their own debts off and how, it's not a good thing for the rest of us to take on this debt. So what are some of the cons to potentially President Biden canceling all this debt for these individuals?
Now, I'm not going to make the argument for the people who are against student debt. I'm pro student debt cancellation because I believe it advances our nation's economic agenda, but it also advances racial equity. Now, what is the one percenters or those Americans who think like, hey, you should pay your own debt. I mean, we don't want to talk about paying debt when you think about the debt that America's owed to Black people who are being disproportionately impacted by the student debt crisis. I think this argument centered around the people who they think, all right, lawyers and doctors, they make a lot of money. They should, take care of themselves. Lawyers and doctors who are making a lot of money, they can afford to pay their student loan debt, right? But those people who don't have the money, don't have the resources, don't have the income, who are still struggling, for them to carry that debt for such a long time. We're not talking about 5 years or 10 years. For most borrowers who are not on a public servant loan forgiveness program, we're talking about 20 to 25 years. That is a very long time to carry a debt. And when you look at the student debt crisis, it is actually the largest non-mortgage consumer debt. That means we have more student debt than cars and than credit card debt. So this is an ever-growing debt, and there is no more effective way to address it than implementing some form of cancellation so that we can help those people who are being heavily burdened by the student debt crisis.
I will say, to Elon Musk's Twitter, it's easier for the top 1%. Or anyone in that social economic status to be in opposition of this, right? Because they have the funds. It's easier for them to not find this advantageous for themselves as it would be for someone from a lower socioeconomic status, and particularly people of color and Black women. Secondly, what I would say is, from what you're saying, Alpha, this is really a racial and economic justice initiative.
It
is what I'm getting from what you're saying.
Yes, it is a racial and economic, justice issue, because the pretense of the question that they should pay their debt come from the assumption that some of these borrowers who attended these colleges had a choice, that, poor people, Black people who actually have less wealth, than the average white family, that they had a choice, that, your parents could have paid your way. Like most Black people who are just studying, if you look at the history of America, you look at the racial discrimination, economic disenfranchisement of Black people, where we're not allowed to accumulate the wealth so that we can support our children through college. Student loan for Black people and for low-income people is not a choice. If you want to go to college and you're Black and your parents don't have the funds, you're going to sign that dotted line. You're not reading to look, what the interest rate is like, or you're not reading to say, what my repayment plan is going to look like when I graduate in 4 years. You're just trying to get an education. Why? Because America taught us. America said that if you want to succeed, if you want to have economic mobility, the best way to do that is to get an education. And most Black people did that. Even Black women. After Black women get the education, right? After they get the undergraduate degree, that is still not enough. They are still getting paid less than white men. They are still getting paid less than white women. So for Black women to get to the point where they can be economically stable, they have to pursue these advanced degrees. And what comes with these degrees? More student debt. But that is what is required for them to achieve that level of success. So even if you see a Black lawyer or a Black doctor who's making $200,000, $300,000, right? They have already accumulated that debt. They are struggling still because they don't have means. They are looking after other people, right? You have a situation where most, successful Black people have to not only take care of themselves, because if you're successful as a Black person, some of us are the first Black lawyers in our family. We're the first Black doctors, right? There is the burden to help the generation of your family members who've been left behind. So you also have that economic burden, that obligation to take care of your family, plus to pay thousands of dollars in student debt. And then when you add up your life, issues, having children, buying a house, these things, is impacting Black people. It may not affect the 1%ers who can afford to write a check and get that debt paid, but it is affecting that Black family, that Black child, and that Black mother who wants a better future, who is trying to pay the bills for her children, but she can't pay her bills for her children, and she can't pay for daycare because she have to write a check to the United States government for a debt that the government and the President of the United States has the ability to forgive. And I just want to clarify, when I'm talking about people paying, I'm talking about pre-pandemic, before the payment pause was implemented, because right now, obviously, no one is paying student loan debt, at least up until August. So I just want to clarify that. No federal direct student loan borrower is paying making any student loan payment unless they decide to pay voluntarily.
And just going back to my first question, I don't think it's just the 1%ers like Mr. Musk, but I was looking at the statistics, and 45% of Americans are on board with the debt being forgiven. Now, there are some individuals I was reading about who are a bit frustrated by this initiative because they have already paid off their loans and debts, right? So you have this category of individual professionals who are like, well, I've spent all these years, 10, 20, and 30 years paying off my debt, so it's not fair. So what would you potentially say to those individuals?
I mean, my response to that is that low income borrowers, black people, black women, can say, it's not fair that our parents were
Yeah.
economically disenfranchised, that they were subject to racist economic policy. It's not fair that, my parents were not given the opportunity to generate wealth to put me through college. It's not fair that, even when I get the education that I have earned, I cannot get a job because I'm black or because I'm a woman. It's not fair that I have to get this degree for you to give me some sort of legitimacy, for you to pay me what I'm worth. So when you talk about fairness, I don't think that is the best argument to come and address the student debt crisis issue. And I also like to point out, this is not the first time that, we as a country has paid off a debt where a certain percent of the population do not benefit from, right? I mean, we have built up other folks before. We shouldn't look at this as an issue as to, who's benefiting. I always tell people, we have to look at it down from the bottom up. Who's being crushed? Black people are being crushed by this debt. Low income people are being crushed by this debt. The 1% can write a check. And I applaud those people who are able to pay their debt. I think every black person out there wish they had the ability, they didn't have the restraints that they could also write a check to the United States government and clear off that debt. But unfortunately, because the way America is set up, we most black people black borrowers didn't have the opportunity and are still struggling to get the opportunity.
About the group that you were talking about, those individuals possibly being frustrated, and like you're going through the statistics of African Americans who have not been advantaged, essentially. Mm-hmm. I was going to say that within that group, I think there are a lot of African Americans who are professionals who are in that top 5-10%, maybe even 1%, who have been able to pay off their loans. So they may be frustrated as well. But I think your point was interesting.
Yes. And there's always that 1 or 2%, who have the ability to do it. And like I said, we applaud those people and we wish more African Americans, had that choice. But I also just want to point out a statistic, right? A black student from a wealthy black family is more likely to default on their student loan than a white student from a, poor white family. So even when black people attain the wealth, the burden of the debt is still impacting them because this goes beyond you owe me, you got to pay. We're looking at a long history of, racial and economic discrimination, but also in the inability for the federal program, the way the program was designed to function as it was intended by Congress. So this is not just asking to forgive the loan to clear borrowers, but forgiving the student debt will actually help the government fix the institutional problems that is wrong with the entire federal student loan program.
And that's an interesting statistic that you raised, Alpha, right? Like even that small percentage that are able to pay off that debt, they're still more likely to default than their white counterpart, which again goes by, this is really a racial and economic justice. It's not about what's fair. It's not about those who actually in fact paid their debt and them having feelings that because they didn't get it, everyone else shouldn't get it. That's not the way we should see the world society. And so I agree with you. It's not really a good argument. And secondly, what I found interesting is, Forbes has been reporting on this student debt crisis, and particularly the Biden administration, their actions. And one of the things that they have reported on that I had saw upon my research is that the Biden administration, I think himself, has expressly indicated that he opposes any student loan debt forgiveness that would favor attorneys than any other group that's in kind of that caliber of profession. So how do you feel about that? Because as being an attorney, I think sometimes there's just this presumption that no matter what attorney you are, whether it's in the private or public sector or whatever practice you're doing, you make enough money, you're going to pay off your debt more likely beyond or before that 20-year average that it takes generally most people to pay off their debt. And that's not necessarily true.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought that point up, right? Because it reflects a misunderstanding of who student loan borrowers are. Not all attorneys make it to top law firm and make $150,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year, right? There are some attorneys, who go to law school, to go back to the community, to serve that community, to go into public interest, right? There are some doctors, black doctors, who leave the economically disempoverished neighborhood to pursue medicine, not to make big bucks, but to go right back into this community to provide healthcare, to fill, the gap in healthcare equity. I mean, that's a broad generalization, but it doesn't reflect what the data is. Student loan borrowers are not all attorneys. The majority are low income people. So I think that's an important point to highlight, but also to really help the audience understand that are high income people going to benefit from a cancellation? Of course they are, but there have been many cases in American history where the wealthy always ends up benefiting from policies that are intended to help those who are already suffering. So I don't think it's anything new to American history, but what we trying to say is that, hey, it's not lawyers, it's not all lawyers, it's not all doctors, it's not rich people we're talking about. We're talking about people who are already struggling, and then they have this debt on top of them that clearly they cannot pay. They cannot afford to pay it.
I'll also just add, again, as I mentioned earlier, the president does have the authority to cancel it and the authority to really cancel it all. I think there's language explicitly within the Higher Education Act that you may be familiar with, where it talks about waiving, releasing any title, any lien. And so from my reading of that language, it really is broad authority. Essentially, how I read it is that it gives the president, through the Secretary of Education, broad authority to cancel student loan debt. And so we've heard a lot of talk that President Biden is inclined to proffer some type of loan forgiveness, but it would be up to $10K. And that's not even close to any relief for us, let alone the majority of Americans who are burdened by their student loan. And so I'm just curious on what your input on that is, and why won't he just cancel it all?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important point that you just brought, that you raised. But also, I also want to highlight that we're talking about debt that Congress has already appropriated for it, right? We're not talking about debt that, Congress have to, tax and spend, deposit, tax and spend. These are money that's already been out the door. The check has already left the Treasury, right? So this is a debt that is owed to the United States government, that the president has the authority. Congress has already delegated that authority to the president through the Higher Education Act to settle and compromise debt owed to the United States. Now, there is a debate as to how far the president can go, but as for where we are right now and what is likely, right, and what amount of debt will help the most people, yes, people like us, $10,000 is not going to, it's not even going to pay off the outstanding interest that has accumulated, ever since we graduated from college, right? So it's not going to move the needle, but $10,000 may move the needle for those low-income borrowers who are, who only owe $10,000, and they probably certainly might even wiped out their entire debt. But if the president want to have the most impact, right, we're looking at least canceling up to $50,000. That is where you get to move the needle. Canceling up to $50,000 in student debt will actually increase the wealth of, black borrowers and black families by up to 40%. So at least you can move the needles towards closing the racial wealth gap based on the higher number of loans that you cancel or that you settle. So we believe he has the broad authority to do it. The more amount he can do, the better it is for all borrowers, but especially for low-income borrowers.
What is the social and economic consequences of the student loan debt crisis on Americans?
As I was stating earlier, right, for most Americans, student debt is a lifetime debt sentence, right? According to a report by the Educational Trust, black borrowers describe student debt as Jim Crow debt. That, it follows you for, the rest of your lives, your 30s, and you have to pay back a loan in 20 to 25 years. You're going to be well into your retirement trying to pay off this debt if you're not on like public sector loan forgiveness or on a short payment term. But it is burdening not just black people, but also millennials, young people, right? Because your student debt affect your credit worthiness. So when you're trying to buy a house, lenders factors in how much student debt you have, right? Until recently, most lenders will account, will take 1% of whatever you owe in calculating your debt to income ratio. Now, if you owe like $240,000, $300,000, $150,000, 1% of that amount is enough to kick you out of the house that you're trying to get. So it prevents you from obtaining home ownership. It's preventing millennials and young people from even want to, invest in retirement because it's a heavy debt. It's also prevent the ability for young people to engage in entrepreneurship. If you're trying to get a loan, you need good credit, but the credit also taking into account your obligations. And as long as that debt is there, it makes things a little bit harder to move forward economically. Now, in regards to borrowers who default, like I stated earlier, 9 million borrowers are in default of federal student loan debt. The administration has announced a plan to remove these borrowers from default, hopefully possibly put them on a path to repayment once the payment pause expire. But for them, before COVID, they were subject to wage garnishment, offset of their tax refund, a seizure of their, Social Security and disability benefits. So the economic consequences for borrowers is really bad because they are actually taking money that they could have used to pay off other bills, money that they could have used to invest into their children's future, or money that they could have used to take care of family members is going to the treasury of the United States government. So the economic consequences is really, disproportionately impacted on low-income people. But America is going to benefit, right? By removing student debt, you're going to make it more easier for millennials and Black people to participate in the economy because we're going to go out there, we're going to get homes, we're going to start new businesses, we're going to pursue new entrepreneurship dreams. So actually, eliminating student debt in the long run is going to make America better economically.
Yeah, and so really, it sounds like this has been the country's best interest before the Biden administration, but even more now, considering those social and economic consequences that you just stated.
Yes, it's definitely in the best interest of America, in the long run, to forgive student debt, especially when you look at young people. I mean, look at house home prices right now. They're going, they're skyrocketing. So you might be making more than your grandparents did, but you have twice the debt that they had when they were in college. The cost of college has increased 1,200% since the 1980s. 1,200%. So it's like we're doing the same thing that our parents and grandparents did, but it's just that it's costing us more to do. And that's not fair. That's something that has to be addressed. But first, we got to forgive the debt that has been accumulated and make it easier for people to achieve an education without a huge debt burden.
Yeah, and another thing that I'm just curious to add is how successful really has the income-driven repayment plan and the public interest loan service program been in regards to this crisis? Has it mitigated the burden on many Americans? I'm curious if you know the stats or what has been your observance of those two programs.
Now, because the other argument against student debt cancellation is like, why don't you just pay, right? Borrowers are paying. The student loan system itself is fundamentally broken. The existing relief options that are available to borrowers are not working as they were intended, by Congress. There was a recent Government Accountability Office report that came out, and it stated that borrowers who are on income-driven repayment plan, that's a repayment plan. I think most, borrowers are about 4.4 million borrowers are on an income-driven repayment plan, right? So, and that's supposed to relieve the burden of student debt by tying your payment to how much you make, right? To a certain percent of your income. So, and the average plan for IDR, income-based repayment plan, is 20 to 25 years. Well, 4.4 million of these borrowers have been in repayment for 20 to 25 years. Do you know the number of those borrowers who have actually gotten their loan forgiven on an IDR? I think it's around 157 borrowers, right? And then you talk about the Service Loan Forgiveness Program that was supposed to forgive the loans of people who agreed to engage in public service, whether you're working at a nonprofit or working at a local hospital or teaching in education. The government say, all right, we understand you're doing a service to the community, so we're going to reduce the burden of student debt by reducing the time it takes to pay off the loan, right? So the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is actually a 10-year repayment plan. Up until recently, 98% of people who have completed that 10-year repayment term or who at least thought that they had completed the 10-year term, their applications were rejected, okay? So if you try to make the payment and you try to get rid of the debt, it keeps getting worse and worse. But I will give credit to the Biden administration because they have implemented major reform to PSLF that will make it easier for people to count the payment that they have made and thereby fast track the path to forgiveness. The administration has also proposed plan relating to the income-driven repayment plan to make it easier for borrowers who have made this payment to have forgiven. But before these major reform, like a 98% rejection rate, completely unacceptable. So those are things that we try to highlight. Like, it's not just about the debt. It's about the system itself being broken, that even when you try to pay, you think you are making an effort in trying to bring this debt down, but you realize that you actually owe more while you're paying, because the way the interest rate is set up, it keeps going up. And, we have what we call a negative
Right.
amortization. So you're paying interest on top of interest, and you look at your balance and say, hey, I'm paying, X, Y, and Z amount of money per month, but yet your student debt is still going up. Those are things that need major reform, to really fix the system. Cancellation is not going to fix the system entirely. Cancellation is going to help, but you need major reform to fix the existing relief program so that it can work as intended.
Yeah, and that really seems to be the fundamental issue here, right? Like you said, the system is not working as is intended. And from what you've said, I'm curious to get you and Tamara's perspectives and opinions on this issue in general, because, as I mentioned, this is really about propelling economic justice. It's about propelling racial justice. It's about making it fair for all Americans. I'm clearly a proponent of this. I'm confident that President Biden will fulfill this promise. To what extent, I don't know, but it's certainly something that I support. Even if it may not benefit me, I'd rather have some Americans being lifted from this burden than none at all. Tamara, I'll go to you first. What's your opinion on this? Is this something that you support? Alpha, after she answers her question, I have a similarly want to ask you the same question, but from a different lens.
Okay.
Yeah, so for me, I am kind of on the fence about it, to be honest. I don't think really anything in life is free. So I'm interested to see the effects of this if this is implemented. I know this administration has promised a lot of stuff and they have not gone through with it. So as far as putting my faith in this, really seeing this come to full fruition, I honestly don't think it's going to happen.
So are you supporting, to the extent he does do anything, are you in support of that or no?
So as far as forgiving debt, because I'm thinking about it as far as an agreement, and there's no consideration here. Typically, when you've had people who are private workers, are in the military, or nurses in the military, or people who are in education, federal employees, they typically have a 10-year program to where you can pay off your debt or make small installment payments for a 10-year period, and then you have your debt or the remainder of your debt forgiven, essentially. But to just say that you're going to forgive this amount of debt and there's no consequences to the other millions of other taxpayers, I don't really see that happening. So that's why I'm really indifferent about it, just as a taxpayer and just really as an American, because I don't think that it will just be a free ride for the rest of us, to be honest. So I want to see how it plays out. And if it is an initiative that he will go through with, I'm just really interested to see the financial effects and consequences for the rest of the Americans.
So it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, you think there's going to be some conditions on this loan forgiveness. It's not just going to be a free waiving thing. He's going to place some conditions on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's going to be conditions for the rest of us. And I'm interested to see what those conditions look like. So I'm a little leery.
Mm-hmm. No, completely understandable. And that's an interesting perspective. And Alpha, feel free to comment on what Tamara and I just said. But I similarly have that question for you. And also, what has the opposition looked like in your capacity with the National Consumer Law Center and what you guys are doing concerning this crisis? Has this been a big partisan issue on the Democrat and Republican side?
I'm not going to comment as to the politics, right? Because my goal out with the NCLC, we represent low-income people. And if it's a good policy, whether it's a Democratic policy or a Republican policy, if it benefits low-income people and help remove our client base from poverty, we'll support it. We've supported legislation on both sides of the aisle before, and we continue to do that. Tamara raised an important point, an important argument, like there may be some sort of a conditions in regards to how the president implement this loan forgiveness programs. And I mean, based on what we've been hearing, is that they are considering maybe limiting it to income, but also considering, doing what we call means testing, because they are trying to make sure they get to, just a certain amount of borrowers. Not everyone, should get the cancellation. And the problem with that is that there's no good way to do it, right? To do any sort of a income base, to tailor it to income, you need, tax information from borrowers. The Department of Education don't have that information. They don't have the authority. There's no existing law that will allow you to do that. So you can't do it that way. For Black borrowers, the way we are being impacted, some Black women are earning more, right? But the debt that they have is higher. The responsibility that they have to their family and the responsibility that they have in regards to being the first person in that family to make it to college, trying to help extend their family members. I mean, we don't factor in, all those things into account. So in the end, just going by income alone is not going to provide that equity, that we're looking for. And the last thing, I mean, taxpayer, the argument that it's not going to benefit taxpayers actually really, I think, it's misguided, because taxpayers are going to benefit when you have more Americans participating in the economy fairly, and taxpayers are going to benefit when we have a racially, economically fair system where everyone, regardless of your background, you are able to move forward without having the debt drain you down while you're trying to jump over that ladder of poverty.
Interesting points that you raised, Alpha. And the last question I have for you, as we pivot on wrapping this episode up, when is it going to happen? I think all of us have been curious in regards to when we think the Biden administration is going to move on this. And you may not have a definitive answer, but I'm curious on that. And secondly, what, if anything, would you tell Americans, particularly those who are overwhelmingly and disproportionately impacted by this? What advice or suggestions or anything that you would tell them concerning this issue that you think is important for them to know?
I mean, as far as the timing, no one knows when President Biden is going to cancel student debt. The last time he said that we're going to see some action coming in weeks. So we don't know exactly whether I think Tamara said that the chances are very likely that it may happen, but it's also that 5 to 10% chance that it may not happen. And the Tamara raised that even if it happened, it may not be what most Americans are hoping that it is going to be. It may be a little bit harder to get the cancellation. They may have to require some sort of an application to do it, which will actually make it harder for the poor people, because if you're really trying to help poor people, the more red tapes that you create, the more requirements you create, the harder it is for them to get the relief that you want, that you want them to get, because they don't have the resources. I mean, I used to work at Legal Aid. Most of my clients didn't have computers. So the moment you made a requirement that you have to apply to get this relief, the moment you put a requirement that we have to see your income to get this relief, you are excluding those low-income borrowers who are being burdened. And then you're actually really helping the middle class or the higher income borrowers who actually have more education, can actually have the access to apply for these programs, a little bit more quicker. So the form and the shape of what Biden is going to do, no one knows except for Biden and the folks in the White House. But what we're advocating for is that we want broad-based relief. We want relief that is at least, $50,000 up to $50,000, to really make a dent in fighting this issue, to really make a dent in trying to provide economic relief for those Americans who have been struggling with this debt. Now, the payment has been paused for 2 years, and America is still doing great. And I think we're going to do great, even after Biden acts on the student loan. So it's just a matter of understanding that, hey, this is not about how am I going to benefit, right? It's about how are we, I think, as a country. And what we are taught is that we should move together collectively. We should move together collectively toward economic success. We should move collectively towards economic justice. We shouldn't leave someone behind because they didn't have the opportunity to generate wealth to pay their way through college. So this should be seen as a way of like, hey, the more equal and fairer America gets, the better it is for America. And student loan forgiveness is not going to eliminate all of the problems that Black people are facing. I mean, it's not really going to close the racial wealth gap. It's not going to do that, but it's going to help people move closer toward achieving full economic equality and also towards achieving economic mobility. So, I mean, for your listeners out there, put yourself in that single mother shoes who went to a beauty college for the sole purpose of making things better for her family. And when she got there, she got an education thinking that she was going to benefit from it. But it turns out that the degree that she got was not worth the paper it was printed on. But yet, she is still paying for that loan while at the same time trying to provide for her family, to take care of her children, trying to invest in retirement. If you remove that student loan debt, it will allow her to invest her money.
Guys, so we may have had some technical difficulties, but I think you all got a good understanding of where Alpha was ending with his last point regarding this topic. Is that, at least from how I took it, and this is not really an issue about it's about thinking collectively and putting ourselves in the shoes of other, particularly those constituent groups that are really disproportionately and overwhelmingly impacted with the student debt crisis, but also that group that will greatly impact it positively should President Biden forgive, to what extent that may be, student loan debt. And so that is something that I agree with. I thank Alpha for being on this episode today, particularly as our first guest, and also discussing such an important topic. It's also interesting because we just finished talking about one of his other promises, as I mentioned earlier, Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson, and Tamara and I have had the privilege now to talk about his second promise. So we will see if he will do it. But from my end, that's a WAP. And again, thank you for all of those who tune in. And thank you again, Alpha.
Thank you, Alpha.